Welcome to Excelsior 32, the online news source for the Excelsior Project from the New York Council of Deliberation.
My brothers to Excelsior 32, the online news source for the Excelsior Project from the New York Council of Deliberation, ancient accepted Scottish Rite, Northern Masonic jurisdiction. The experiences, comments, opinions, and views shared on this program this evening are those of individual Freemasons and do not reflect the official position of any Grand Lodge, concordant, or appendant body. Our presenter this evening, illustrious Mark Wright, 33rd degree, was born and reared on the Cherokee Indian Reservation of Oklahoma, and his family home is just 3 miles from the Osage Indian Reservation. He is an enrolled citizen of the Kickapoo tribe of Kansas, which legally makes him a real Indian. Illustrious Wright was raised to the sublime degree of Master Mason in 1980 by his father in Bartersville Lodge number 284, a lodge originally chartered by the Grand Lodge of Indian Territory. 3 months later, he was elevated to the 32nd degree in the Valley of Tulsa. In 2011, he was invested with the rank and dignity of a Knight Commander of the Court of Honor, the Southern jurisdiction version of RMSA. And in 2015, he was coroneted an Inspector General Honorary 33rd degree, both in the Valley of Washington, D.C. He served for 8 years as an appellate judge for the Sac and Fox tribe, taught Indian law at 3 different colleges, and practiced law as a trusts and estates attorney. He was starting a second career as an opera singer when he was called to Washington in 2004 to be the director of the National Indian Probate System. After the Bush administration, he stayed in Washington, teach at Georgetown University. Returning to his stage roots, he also appeared on screen in The West Wing and on stage as a ballet supernumerary at the Kennedy Center. At this time, he was also honored to be the worshipful master of the historic Federal Lodge number 1 of Washington, D.C. in 2013. Today, besides being the Grand Scribe of the Grand Chapter of Royal Arch Masons of the District of Columbia, he fills his spare time by reviewing restaurants, playing the organ too loudly at various church services, and pursuing his chosen career as a bon vivant and lovable ne'er-do-well. It's my honor and pleasure to present to you illustrious Mark Wright.
Thank you very much, Brother Peter. Illustrious Richard, thank you as well. It's a pleasure to be here. I don't know if any of you happen to be in Long Island this past weekend to see my friends on the Oklahoma Masonic Indian degree team. That's me with them right there. I don't do work with them because that requires learning Oklahoma ritual, and I don't want to confuse my DC stuff, but I help them out with their color guards at shrine circuses and powwows and what have you. Today, we're going to talk about something that is in the news, and that is the new movie opening tomorrow in New York and Friday nationwide called Killers of the Flower Moon. It's a big project of Martin Scorsese, starring Robert De Niro, Leo DiCaprio, and Lily Gladstone. It's gotten a lot of play around here in Oklahoma where I am today, simply because this is where they filmed the movie. The story is set in Fairfax, Oklahoma, but they did most of the filming in Pawhuska and Bartlesville, and then some of the courtroom scenes are being done in Tulsa. But it's about the Osage Indians. Now, this used to be a major tribe in the country. You can see their territory, most of Oklahoma, Arkansas, Kansas, Missouri, and then a little bit of some other places. And then they got forced, as most Indians did, into smaller and smaller territories. If you look at the yellow rectangle along the bottom of Kansas, that's where they were pushed. So that became the new Osage territory. They went from this enormous 4-state to a little strip down in Kansas. And if you look in that yellow triangle on the far right lower corner, you'll see a town called Independence. Well, just a little bit outside of Independence to the southwest, there was a little log cabin built. And many of you may be familiar with Little House on the Prairie, story of Laura Ingalls Wilder and her family. One of the things we're going to do today is we're going to talk about the Masons who were involved in all of this. Her father and her husband were both Masons, and she, her mother, and her sister were in Eastern Star. Mrs. Ingalls was worthy matron of her chapter 3 times, and at one time served as district deputy grand worthy matron, or whatever they call it in Star, in Missouri. So that was there, and they were squatters on the Osage Reservation. And finally, they were told and convinced by the government they had to move. Now, this is Oklahoma. So you can see where Oklahoma Indian Territory is, where all of the tribes were. This is right after the Trail of Tears. And I don't know whether they teach this in New York, but this is when you had 5 major tribes in the southeast part of the United States who were forcibly moved into what was then called Indian Territory. And this happened during the presidency of Most Worshipful Brother Andrew Jackson, past Grand Master of Tennessee. So this is where they were located. And then we had the Civil War. And there's another Mason who came along by the name of Albert Pike, Confederate general. He had been exploring in Indian Territory and befriended many of the tribes, and the Confederates put him in charge of Indian affairs. Now, you hear the language, as long as the river shall run and the grass shall grow, in Indian treaties. That's never in a United States treaty. That was only in Confederate treaties, no doubt because of the remarkable intellect of Brother Pike. But as the war came along, he convinced the Indians that the Union was not going to protect them, and that if they didn't want their lands burned, they had better support the Confederacy. Well, some of them did. And what happened? Well, they lost. And then that gave the federal government the opportunity to come in here and take them from having the whole state into just the green area. The Cherokees lost their Cherokee outlet strip. And in 1872, the Osages were being moved out of Kansas, so they actually bought about 1.5 million acres in the very eastern end of the Cherokee outlet as their reservation. Now, if we look at this in terms of size, Osage Reservation, which is now Osage County, Oklahoma, was 2,304 square miles. State of Rhode Island is only 1,545 square miles. State of Delaware is just a little bit larger than the reservation. They're at 2,489 square miles. So this is a fairly large territory. Now, so you know where we're talking. You can see Tulsa, major city. I hope you've heard of it. And then to the north is Bartlesville, mostly known as the birthplace of Phillips Petroleum. And then Ponca City to the west, which was the birthplace of Marland Oil and then Continental Oil that became Conoco. So those are oil companies you have probably heard of. Now, for your reference, in New York is about 2/3 of the size of Oklahoma. If you didn't have all that New York stuff down at the bottom, it would fit in the Oklahoma map a little bit more neatly. Now, Osages are there. 1896, they've discovered that there's some oil underneath the ground. And so a man by the name of Henry Foster managed to get a 10-year lease to drill for the oil under the entire reservation. Now, this had to be approved by the U.S. Department of the Interior, and it took them a while, and it didn't get approved until after his death. So they finally got that in 1906. And his brother officially took ownership, but immediately turned it over to his son. But in the meantime, everyone was wanting to come to Oklahoma because this was the biggest find in terms of adventure and money in the country. The Oklahoma oil boom was bigger than the California gold rush, if you can imagine that. So here we have the son, Henry Vernon Foster, or H.V. Foster, who is a Mason, 32nd degree, Knight Templar. And the man on the left is not HV, it's Bill with one L. And he is the commander of the Knight Templar Commandery here in Bartlesville. And he has H.V. Foster's commandery sword. If you look carefully, you can see where it's engraved H.V. Foster. Now, what Foster did is he wasn't one of those people to go out and get his hands dirty. He was the businessman, and he came up with a smart plan where instead of doing all the drilling himself, he divided it up into parcels and then leased the parcels to other oil companies. One of the big ones was Ernest Marland with Conoco. He had the western part of the reservation because it was over close to Ponca City. And he had a very distinguished career, not only in oil, but in politics, former governor of Oklahoma. And then if we go to the eastern side, we have Frank Phillips, illustrious Frank Phillips, 33rd degree, who founded with his brother Phillips Petroleum Company. And here on the right is one of our members in Bartlesville, Newell Barker, who is a 33rd degree Mason and happened to be a Phillips employee and acquired Frank Phillips's 33rd degree ring after Phillips's death. And I looked at that and I thought, oh my God, those are great big real diamonds. And it just looks tacky as it can be. But apparently our Supreme Council didn't have regulations on the 33rd degree rings back then, because from that same era, I've also seen Frank S. Land's ring. He was the founder of DeMolay, and I think you've got DeMolay in New York. And he had a silver ring that was given to him by Harry S. Truman. And of course, the regulations say it's supposed to be a triple band of gold. And currently, it may be surmounted by a black triangle with the 33 on the inside. And then if you wish, on two of the sides of the triangle, you can put little diamond chips. But certainly today, we would not have a great big 33. Now, the Osages had a lot of special property laws. This is the time when the government is wanting to assimilate Indians into American society. They didn't do a very good job going about it. But what they did is, first of all, they decided they were going to take the Indians' money and land and divide it up amongst each of the Indians. So they took the Indian territory that they'd been forced into, saying that's your final home, and they divided it up. And for most of the tribes, we've got 570 some tribes in the country. Most of these Indians were given 160 acres as their allotment. Now, the Osages made an argument that they won, that this is not just one of those things where the government had moved them in, but they had actually bought and paid for their reservation land. So they didn't think it was right to divide up the land to each Osage, and whatever is left over, open that to white settlement with no compensation. So they arranged to actually divide the entire Osage reservation roughly equally with all of the members, and they ended up with 657 acres apiece. Now, they didn't do anything with it. The idea originally with allotment is that the Indians would become farmers. Back in the 19th century, that was sort of considered a highest and best use for gentlemen to be farmers and to have land. But the Indians didn't farm. So the Bureau of Indian Affairs took over the leasing of the land for agriculture or for grazing or for timber rights or whatever. And then that money and profit allegedly went back to the Indians. Now, the Osages did one other thing that nobody else had the foresight to do. And I'm sure that the tribes in Oklahoma and Kansas wish they had thought of this idea. But the Osages says, we bought this land, and we want to reserve all of the mineral rights to the tribe. We don't want it chopped up. It all goes to the tribe. And so, okay, the feds agree with it. Congress did a law, 1906, and they did a roll of the Osages and found at that time they had 2,229 Osages. Now that's down a lot because from say 1810, when they've got records, up until 1900, the Osages lost about 90% of their population to European diseases, primarily smallpox. So this is all that's left of the Osages. But every one of those members, man, woman, or child, was given an interest in the tribal mineral estate, and that interest is called a headright. 1906, it didn't do a whole lot because we were just starting oil exploration and drilling and pumping and all of that. But eventually they started getting quarterly payments of money with their oil royalties, and the Osages became the richest people per capita in the world at this time in the 19 teens, 20s, and 30s. We had some other things that had to come along with that to manage that. But they were very rich people. They were going for the good stuff. They were known for having the best cars of the time. And I remember as a child, my dad was joking about how the Osages would go out and buy a new Cadillac and drive it till it ran out of gas. Then they'd abandon it at the side of the road and go buy a new one because they had that kind of money. The Osages were evangelized way back when by the Jesuits, and they're one of the few tribes that the Jesuits managed to maintain relationships with. So they have a very gorgeous Cathedral of the Osages in Pawhuska, the capital of the Osage Nation, called Immaculate Conception Catholic Church. And the Osages gave so much money to the church that the Pope actually gave them a dispensation to put stained glass windows in this church that depicted live, living Osage people. The policy of the church was no living people in the windows, and even the European royalty and monarchs were not allowed to do that, but the Osages were because of their gifts to the church. Now, there's another thing that has influenced you people in New York, and I don't know how many of you are aware, but this month there have been all kinds of special celebrations and performances for the New York City Ballet's 75th anniversary. Now, you probably have heard the name of George Balanchine, who was the founder and the choreographer of NYCB. But when he came into New York, he brought with him his wife, Maria Tallchief, prima ballerina, the very first prima ballerina in the United States. And she was becoming famous worldwide. So she was known for her Swan Lake. She was known for her Firebird because Balanchine was a personal friend of Stravinsky. And the thing for which I've always hated her is in 1954, Balanchine took an obscure little Tchaikovsky ballet called Nutcracker, mounted a production at NYCB, and now it has become the ubiquitous, you can't get away from it in December, ballet all over the country. Even the little civic ballet here in Bartlesville, America, does a Nutcracker every December. But Maria Tallchief was the original Sugar Plum Fairy in America, and her performance is what has spread the Nutcracker all over America and now all over the world. So David Grann started hearing all about these stories of the Osages and how there were murders because people were trying to get the Osages money. And most people outside of this immediate area never knew anything about that. You know, it's not officially taught in the public schools, even in Oklahoma. And I know college history professors that didn't know anything about it. Well, you know, I grew up 3 miles from the Osage Reservation, and my parents are personal friends with a lot of Osages. We participated in a lot of the Osage ceremonial dances and regularly went to Pawhuska for events. So I've always known about the Osage murders. Now, certainly not to the detail and the extent that I have learned this year, but we always knew that it happened. So this kind of interested me. And the Osages referred to this as the reign of terror because they were being killed and they didn't know who was doing that. Now, the book, Killers of the Flower Moon, spends pretty much all of its time talking about the Kyle family. And these are the four Kyle daughters, Minnie and Jimmy's children. And of course, every one of them has a head right. Jimmy had a head right. Minnie had a head right. So this is a family with 6 head rights. Now, Molly is the main character. Now, here is a cartoon that was in the Enid, Oklahoma newspaper, talking about why she was so important in the Osage murder case. And it's because her income in, I think this was 1926 when they printed this cartoon, her income was $135,000 a year, which in today's dollars is $2,347,543.22. And that's every year. And on top of that, Indian money is not federally taxable. So just think of your income tax savings on your $2.3 million income. Molly's sister Minnie died in 1918. She was a young woman. She was healthy, but all of a sudden she came up with what they were calling a wasting disease. Didn't know what happened. It was a big shock to the family. And they just were suspicious, but they didn't know what happened. And then in 1921, Molly's sister Anna was found shot in a ravine near Fairfax. And around the same time, there was another Indian who was found shot in another part of the reservation. This is all becoming very suspicious to the Osages in the Fairfax part of the reservation. And then in 1922, the mother, Lizzie, dies again of a mysterious sort of wasting illness. And what we're believing now is that they were slowly being poisoned so that it would appear that they were dying of natural causes. 1923, Molly's sister Rita and her husband Bill were killed when in the middle of the night their house was bombed. It exploded. It killed the two of them, and it killed their 19-year-old maid, a white girl, who was living with them in the house. So, clearly this family is being targeted because as all of these people die off, the head rights are being inherited by Molly. Now, here's another thing that happens in 1923. Henry Roan, cousin to the Kyle family, and incidentally, with traditional Indian way marriage, he was Molly's first husband when they were teenagers. He was found shot in 1923. Now, this is where the Indian murders start getting real to me. This is not just some history about a bunch of dead Indians. We're now talking about families that I know personally. Now, this is a contemporary picture from the 70s. The lady on the right is Georgianne Gray Robinson, and she was the granddaughter of Henry Roan. Now, Georgianne Robinson and my mother, who is the lady, Georgianne's in a Seminole dress, and my mother is in an Osage dress. She's the one on the left. And interestingly, my mother should be in the Seminole dress and Georgianne should be in the Osage dress because that's what our ancestries are. But my mother and Georgianne were very, very close friends until Georgianne's death in the mid-'80s. And then here's another picture of them. This is from 1967. Georgianne's on the far right. My mother's on the far left. And this shows you what the Indian ladies in this part of the country were looking like because of the wealth of the Indians. We're not talking about people living in poverty. These ladies are dressed to kill. And of course, now I understand after studying the Osages, this is why my mother has a mink coat. She's got one of those floor-length mink coats. And we are not a wealthy family, so that's an unusual purchase. But it's because all of her friends were Osages, and they all had mink coats. So that's why she got it. Now, here's another thing that happened. William Stepson, another Alati, was poisoned in 1922, probably with tainted moonshine. He is the grandfather of the man on the right, Marvin Stepson. And Marvin and I were together on the Supreme Court of the Sac and Fox tribe for 8 years. So I've known him for a long time. So now we have the Gray family, and we have the Stepson family. And these are people that I know really well personally. Plus, there are a whole lot of other families that I'm at least acquainted with. So this becomes a real thing to me. The Osages naturally are very concerned. They can't get anything out of local law enforcement. It's all being covered up. They're not paying attention to it. Nobody really wants to investigate or look into it. They can't find any evidence. So they sent a delegation to Washington, talked to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. They went to the White House. They talked to the Department of Justice, and they're really trying to get something done about these murders. And even Oklahoma governor finally, at this point, sends his personal investigator. Now, Governor Walton's 32nd degree Mason, but his investigator, his personal investigator that he sent, got to Osage County and got in on the take. He started taking bribes from people, and so therefore he didn't find anything. Now, for other reasons, in 1924, Governor Walton was impeached as governor, and he was also expelled from Masonry for conduct unbecoming a Mason in 1924. And I couldn't find out exactly why. I did some research, and I consulted with my main historical consultant, Brother Trayson Akers, 32nd degree KCCH elect, who is the expert on Oklahoma Masonic and Masonic Indian history, and he didn't really know the exact details of what was unbecoming. But what we do know about his impeachment, it was largely because Governor Walton was against the KKK. And the KKK was a big political force in Oklahoma in the 1920s. Now, back in Washington, the doors were rattled, and so the president appointed Harlan Fiske Stone to be Attorney General. And he wanted to clean up things in the Bureau of Investigation within the Department of Justice, because it had been being headed up by a man who was sort of a famous private investigator of sorts from out in California. And they just were not really doing a very good job at all. And they weren't able to handle the major case that was on their table, the Teapot Dome scandal. And I don't know how many of you remember your American history. Teapot Dome was an oil structure out in Wyoming where the leasing rights were fraudulently handled and administered. Later, Mr. Stone would become a Supreme Court justice. And then after that, Brother Franklin Roosevelt, 32nd degree, appointed him as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So we have a good guy here, not a Mason, but a good guy who is looking to patch up the Bureau of Investigation and do a legitimate job of investigating crime. Remember, we've just started prohibition in this area, and we have all the mobsters that were starting to come out in the big cities. So he looks to this young lawyer, 29-year-old lawyer, working in the Bureau of Investigation at the Department of Justice by the name of John Edgar Hoover. And he was quite the go-getter. So he became, in December of 1924, the director of the Bureau of Investigation. Their offices were in this building that you see in the upper left corner, no longer standing, but it's in the McPherson Square area of Washington, D.C. Hoover contacted an FBI agent by the name of Tom White, who had former experience as a Texas Ranger. And he was kind of the old school. He was the old kind of investigator and a law enforcement person. Not really what Hoover wants, but he knew that this was the person that would be needed to get to Oklahoma and straighten it out. And Hoover was all about process. He wanted everything to be modern. He wanted to use science and technology and all of those things to solve crime in an academic sort of way. Now, who do we have for Hoover? Well, born in DC, raised in my Federal Lodge number 1. And then in 1926, with all of these young lawyers at the Department of Justice, and particularly the Bureau of Investigation, started Justice Lodge as an affinity lodge for FBI employees in DC. Justice Lodge ultimately merged with Columbia Lodge, which was an affinity lodge for Treasury employees. And now they still exist as one of the active lodges in DC as Justice Columbia number 3. Eventually, this Bureau of Investigation would become the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or the FBI, in 1935. And this is mostly because of the success of the Osage murder investigation and convictions. It wiped out the bad memories of Teapot Dome, and it showed that you have an FBI that can come in here and you can do a criminal investigation and you can get convictions where nobody had been able to do it for close to a decade. And so this was very successful for them. And Hoover really relished this and milked it for all it was worth. They did an FBI movie around this period of time, and the Osage murders were one of the cases that were featured prominently in that. He ultimately would become a 33rd degree and Grand Cross. I don't know if you have Grand Cross in the Northern Masonic jurisdiction, but that is the very, very, very highest honor from the Supreme Council. We only have our Supreme Council meet every 2 years. This year was one of those years. They granted 6 in the entire Southern jurisdiction. So it's a very rare honor for distinguished Masons. I generally think of it as somebody that's a thank you for the octogenarians and the nonagenarians who have devoted their life to the craft. So for somebody like Hoover to get it, he apparently was very active at the time. Also in 1924 and 25, he opened up the Office of Identification. And this became the first organized national repository of fingerprints. Fingerprints had been around for a while, but if you don't have records, you don't have anything to compare to, it's hard to say who they belong to. Well, he started organizing and collecting them in this office. And of course, countless crimes have since been solved by fingerprints. Now, the FBI got to, or I should say the BOI got to the Osage Reservation and started doing their undercover investigation. And they started noticing some strange things, and it was financial. And this is what really broke open the case. They found out that this guy by the name of William King Hale had been taking out these life insurance policies. And then he had a life insurance policy that he'd taken out on Henry Roan for $25,000. Now, back then, $25,000 was a lot of money. And the argument was being made that it was there as a guarantee that the money that Henry Roan had borrowed from Bill Hale would be repaid. Now, these two men were friends. And Henry Roan had said repeatedly that Bill Hale was his best friend. And at Henry's funeral, Bill Hale was one of the pallbearers. So, who is this guy? Well, he is a 32nd degree Mason, a Knight Templar, a Shriner. He sometimes held himself out as a minister, but he came from Texas. Settled in the late 1890s. He was originally just a ranch hand, but he saved his money and he started buying up land for grazing. Eventually, he amassed a $45,000 ranch, and he was sort of the local benefactor. He was donating to the poor. He was supporting churches. He was supporting schools. He was supporting hospitals. The Osages knew that they would get help from him if they had a short period of time, or some of the other people, they needed a loan. Even though the Osages had all this money, they didn't necessarily get access to the money because they had guardians appointed for them, and the guardians didn't always want to give them the money. So he was thought to be a real friend of the Osages. He became the majority owner of the local bank. He became a part owner of the general store. He became a part owner of the funeral home. So, these are all the main income sources in a little town like Fairfax. He was even appointed a reserve deputy sheriff, which gave him special access to the jail and to the story about the crime. Now, he'd been raised in Gray Horse Lodge in 1907. From what we can tell, he was not really an active Mason. Now, he liked to wear the pins. You can see in this picture, he's wearing a shrine pin. And then that's who he was. So Martin Scorsese found the story. He found the book, the Grann's book, and he decided he would do a movie. Now, they came in with one idea, and it was going to be a big crime drama. He wanted to focus on the investigation and the trial and the case. And after they got there and worked with the Osages, they completely rewrote it so that more than half of the movie basically acquaints you with the Osage people and what they were experiencing and what was going on. So here is Robert De Niro playing the role of William Hale, and Leonardo DiCaprio is playing the role of Ernest Burkhart, the nephew of Bill Hale. And then here in the upper left is Ernest Burkhart and Molly Burkhart, his wife. And then down here you can see a picture from the movie. Now, Leo came in, or I shouldn't say Leo, Ernest came in and really wooed Molly. He even went to the trouble to learn the Osage language because that was her primary speaking language. And eventually they did get married. Now, how did the Masons get involved in this? Well, when they decided to completely re-script this story for the movie, researchers came in, and the old Fairfax newspaper happened to have this little note in 1925. Scottish Rite Club going to have Scottish Rite Maundy Thursday service. Now, I don't know what you all do for that. I think you all have, what do you call it? Feast of the Paschal Lamb or something like that. I see that in Tom Labaugh's stuff all the time. These are pictures from Southern jurisdiction. It's basically like a Tenebrae service that is done in a number of churches, where you have the candelabrum that is extinguished one candle at a time and then relit one candle at a time. And that's the Scottish Rite service. So they took that and they jumped on it. And somehow they decided, well, let me go right here. They decided that they were going to use the lodge in Fairfax as one of their sites for filming. Gray Horse Lodge, now we're talking about a tiny town here. Today it's got a population of less than 5,000. But this building was built by them, occupied in 1924. They shared it with the bank, and they had part of the upstairs. The rest of the upstairs were professional offices. Old building, still there today. And they spent a lot of money fixing it up for the movie. You can see here these white hoses. This is during the filming. We went over to Pawhuska, or over to Fairfax, and kind of watched what they were doing, see what they were up to. These are air conditioning ducts that they were trying to pipe in because the building does not have central heat and air. On the right, I am with the District Deputy Grand Master for Fairfax and Ponca City, and Matt McGee. We were looking here at the cornerstone of the new building. Now, this is the inside of the lodge. You can see the dais for the east, and then you can see coming in from the Tyler's door, you can see it's a long, narrow building. And it has deep blue walls, and then you see oval frames on both sides of the walls that are for each of the masters of the lodge since they were founded in the late 1800s. Now, this is a scene from the movie in the lodge room. Now, the one big difference is they went to great expense to have a checkered pavement carpet woven that could be put on the floor for the lodge room scenes. And then when they got done, they packed it up and took it with them. They didn't leave it for the lodge. Now, here's another scene. And this is something that I have to remember, that this is a historical fiction, because according to the movie, and not according to the book or any of the facts that I've seen, Bill Hale brings his nephew Ernest into the lodge as a Mason. And then we get to a certain point in the events where Bill Hale is really upset with what his nephew has done, takes him up to the lodge room and spanks him. This is one of the big comments I heard after the Cannes Film Festival, that there is this brutal scene of corporal punishment where poor Leo DiCaprio is being spanked. Now, I don't know of any Masonic degree where that would take place, and I don't know of any lodge that would have that sort of thing or tolerate it being done, but this is the movies. Now, let me go back up here. One of the things I was wondering is whether or not the Osages were in Masonry. Now, keep in mind that the Osages are predominantly all Roman Catholic. So there's already a predisposition not to be involved in Freemasonry because of the Catholicism. And the Osages also maintain their traditional Ilanshka religion, very traditional tribal rites. But I did find in the lodge in Pawhuska, Washashi Lodge in Pawhuska, that they have Charles Mashonkashe, who is, the Mashonkashes are one of the big, well-known families in the Osage tribes, who was a master of the lodge. And according to this article that was printed, he's the only full-blood Indian to become a Knight of the York Cross of Honor. Now, this is Scottish Rite. You may not know what KYCH is, but this is to honor someone who is past master of his lodge, past high priest of his council, his chapter, past illustrious master of his council, and past eminent commander of his Knight Templar commandery. So you can see that the Mashonkashes were involved. On the tombstone, you see a square and compass, and then in the shadow for Opal, his wife, you can see the Eastern Star logo. So other than that, I really don't know of very many Indians in Pawhuska that are that are Masons. Now, because of finding these insurance policies, the FBI started to focus on Bill Hale. And eventually they had enough to have him arrested. So they issued the summons, picked him up. He showed up at the courthouse. And this is the one thing that's noted in Grann's book, the only thing that talks about Masonry. He showed up wearing a diamond square and compass lapel pin. Now, that's all about Masonry that's in the book. All of this other stuff is fiction. So here are the two in the middle, the two suspects that are going to trial. And on the first trial in 1926, they were convicted. But that was taken up on appeal on jurisdictional grounds because it was done in federal court and not in Osage County State Court. But a week after this conviction, the Grand Lodge of Oklahoma was good enough to step in and expel Bill Hale from Masonry for life. So he's no longer a Mason. And also, I could find no record with the Grand Lodge that Ernest Burkhart was ever an Oklahoma Mason, even though it says in the movie that he was brought into the lodge and became a member. But there's no record with the Grand Secretary. We've checked twice. So I don't think he was at all. Now, the issue on the appeal has to do with federal criminal law dealing with Indians. We have a Major Crimes Act back in the 19th century because white people didn't want to be subject to Indian jurisdiction if they committed a crime. So major crimes were reserved to the federal government. But here's the thing. The defendant had to be an Indian, or if it had to be the victim of the crime and have that crime take place in Indian country. Now, that's something that has evolved in definition over the year, but it's basically Indian reservations, Indian territories, Indian casinos, Indian clinics, Indian housing programs. That's what you have to get the federal jurisdiction. Eventually, the appeal came back and it was affirmed that Henry Roan's allotment was indeed Indian country for purposes of the law, so they could retry him in federal court. 6 cases happened because of Bill Hale. They had that case, convicted but appealed, and then Ernest Burkhart finally confessed to his involvement in the Smith House bombing, so he pled guilty and was sentenced to life. And then Hale and Ramsey were retried in state court, and there was a hung jury, so that got thrown out. And that was full of bribery. And then Brian Burkhart was tried for Anna Brown's death. That's another nephew of Bill Hale, another hung jury. Finally, we get to Hale and Ramsey being retried in federal court. We did get a first-degree murder conviction, but the jury specified the penalty at life imprisonment, not the usual death penalty that was given out for first-degree murder. And then finally, Blackie Morrison was convicted of Anna's death. Now, why was all this an issue? Well, up until 1879, an Indian was not a person. We have a famous case with the Ponca chief Standing Bear, where they were asking for habeas corpus and they had to take it up on appeal. And the courts ruled that, yes, Indians are people. Here's the other thing. Right about the time this is starting up, what's going on over in Tulsa? You may have heard of the Tulsa Race Massacre, where you had a black shoeshine boy that allegedly accosted an elevator operator girl in an elevator. Turns out it hadn't happened, but that caused a riot. And the white people in Tulsa, with the KKK influence, burned the Greenwood district that was considered the Black Wall Street of America. And see, we have all this history. Here's another one of Trace and Acre's stories about the power of the KKK in Oklahoma and how so many Masons were involved. Now, the one thing to be said in defense of Oklahoma Masons and the KKK is Oklahoma KKK was all about morals. And you have all of these, people coming in from all over that were not the best character. And so that's what they were trying to police, people of bad moral character. It wasn't the thing that you see down in the Deep South where it was all about persecuting blacks. This was more about maintaining morality. Not that I'm condoning it, but that was their thing. So we had all of these people that did their convictions. They didn't stay in prison very long. Ernest Burkhart was life sentenced, but he got paroled, the argument being that he had testified in his uncle's trial and helped with that conviction. But the Hales really were not apologetic about this. This is right before his final conviction in 1929. And here he is, just all smiles with his wife and daughter on the courthouse steps. Finally, he was convicted. 1929, and did end up going to prison for a while. So, this is just all of the case. This is what they were originally going to make the movie about. After his final conviction, he sold his 45,000 acre ranch. It was divided between the Mullendore Ranch, the Crossbill Ranch, and the Drummond Ranch. Well, the Mullendores, now E.C. III is a master mason. He was murdered in 1970. Still hasn't solved that particular case, but his family had a large tract in northeastern Osage County. The Drummond family are now the largest landowner in the entire Osage Reservation. And it's a big family. There are several branches. One branch happens to be the husband of the pioneer woman. Some of you and some of your wives may watch Ree Drummond on the what is the Home and Garden Network, I think. She has her blog and she has her TV show, and now she has a big store and restaurant in Pahuska, all about food and gracious living. And it's so funny to me that she's the pioneer woman, because her family went to my church in Bartlesville. Her father was the orthopedic surgeon in town. They were the country club types, and she was in the ballet. And now she's Miss Let's Live in the Country and castrate cattle. So it's a different thing. The other thing is Gentner Drummond. He is the Attorney General of the state of Oklahoma. He was well known as being the commander of the first military mission in Desert Storm. Now, this is the 1991 Let's Save Kuwait from the Iraqis war. So he's highly thought of. And November the 5th, he'll be getting his KCCH here in Oklahoma. So this is where the land ended up. Now, according to the FBI investigations, there were about 60 deaths. Well, it's more than that, because the Osages and their chief will tell you that they have 200 people that died during this period, and the deaths were never investigated. Now, Bill Hale is not the great big bad guy here, because he's only suspected, not necessarily proven, but suspected in about 24 of the deaths. Now, the problem with all this murder that was going on, this book is focusing on Fairfax. It's not talking about Pahuska. It's not talking about Hominy, but it's happening all over the reservation. So there was this big diaspora of Osages going to other places where they could use their wealth and live away from the dangers and the risks of living in the county. And today, they only have 6 full-blood Osages who are still living. They have spread out, and their blood is becoming more dilute. This is a picture from the premiere of the movie, which I'm sure you'll all be looking forward to seeing this weekend. But the whole question, why did this happen? Why do we care? And it's all about our attitudes. And you can apply this to anything in the world. It's like right now, are you in favor of Israel or are you in favor of Hamas? And what are we considering? Well, here the question that the Osages are asking is whether or not they can get a conviction, because does a white man killing an Osage Indian constitute murder, or is it merely cruelty to animals? Because this is the attitude. Remember Standing Bear, 1879, before Indians were people. And there was always the disrespect between the white people coming in to take over, to hunt, to farm, to ranch on Indian land. Let's just push the Indians away. Let's just shoot the Indians. They're a nuisance. So are we exterminating an invasive species? Or are these real people? So here's the Osages today. Picture down at the bottom of the men who were members of Gray Horse Lodge. But this is where we are. Does anyone have any questions? Well, good. Looks like I put everybody to sleep.
Okay, no, I'm just unmuting. If anybody has any questions, you can throw them in the chat, or just say that you've got a question and we'll call on you. And while they're doing that, I know Bob Siebold always has some questions in the can, but I think you kind of answered my question was going to be with regard to the no death penalty given to Hale and Ramsey, and was that because the victims were Native Americans and not seen as people, so to speak?
Mm-hmm.
And I think you've
Very
kind of already answered that. So I know you mentioned Brother Akers a few times. He is on with us tonight. So
is he?
Yes,
I
he
shouldn't have talked about him.
So,
Trace is a good friend of mine, and we'll be excited to see him get his KCCH November the 5th as well with the Attorney General. But he is, what is he, the Grand Senior Warden or Grand Captain General of the Grand Commandery here, and is kind of the person I always look to when I have questions about Masonic history, Indian Territory history, Oklahoma Territory history. You probably don't realize that the Grand Lodge of Indian Territory, the Grand Lodge of Oklahoma Territory, both still exist. They formed the Grand Lodge of the state of Oklahoma, but there now technically are 3 Grand Lodges here in Oklahoma. And he's the one who can tell you all of the history about any of that.
Wow. So I've enabled everybody to unmute themselves. So some people don't like typing questions in, but Bob Siebold, where are you? I know you had a couple of questions. Do you want to, out there?
Yeah, for sure. So I read the book. I really enjoyed the book a lot. I thought it was really great. And you're 100% right. There's no real mention of Freemasonry at all in the book. And actually, I didn't really know about the connection to Freemasonry until I saw your post about this lecture on Facebook, to be quite honest with you. So thank you for that. I guess my question would be, and I'll preface it this way, because you've not seen the movie, neither is anyone else on tonight's presentation. But do you think this is going to hurt Freemasonry from a public awareness perspective, or do you think it's going to, people are going to go, it just is what it is, or what do you think? Because
many of you probably know Bob Davis, who is past Grand Master of Masons, past Grand High Priest, past Grand Commander, and currently the illustrious Grand Master in Oklahoma. Well-known Masonic researcher, lecturer, 33rd degree Grand Cross, everything. Bob and I have been talking about this because he has prepared a document to send to all of the Oklahoma lodges on how to respond to the public reaction to the role of Masonry in the movie. But he's waiting to go see the movie tomorrow or Friday to see what exactly they do. Now, as far as taking Leonardo DiCaprio to spank in the Gray Horse Lodge, aside from that being kind of weird, I don't know that the public will hold that against the craft. Mm-hmm. The one thing that concerns me a little bit more is, we were around the filming when they were at Gray Horse Lodge. Now, it was a closed set, so I didn't have the opportunity to go up and watch from the side. But what I have heard from people that were in the cast, but not Masons, and that's kind of important. They're not Masons, so they don't know what to look for. One of the scenes that was filmed was the Maundy, Thursday service that they did in the lodge. And what they were saying is they were going to be superimposing the face of some of the murdered Osages as each of these candles are extinguished in that service. Now, first of all, I don't know that that's true. Secondly, I don't know that that made the final cut in the movie, because Scorsese was really pushed to shorten this movie. It's 3.5 hours long with no intermission. And the reason it didn't compete at Cannes was because it was too long. Sure. But he won't cut it. He is of the philosophy that, people are streaming, they're sitting there for hours. This is a movie, it's not a TV show. So he's proud of the fact that it's 3.5 hours long. But whether this scene made it in, I don't know. I've been in a lot of shows where we have filmed and things I filmed for 2 days, and then none of that made it into the final edit.
No, and yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I remember, this was a while ago, there was a film called The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, and the villain in that movie wears a Masonic ring. And people who've known him for years said, oh, I guess there's some bad Masons. Well, that's human dynamics. There's always going to be guys who are going to embrace the craft for what it is and live the tenets, or not. And I think when you and I spoke, we kind of had that level setting meeting with Rick. I think what you said was, with Hale, the Hale character is, he might have worn a Masonic square and compass, but never wore it in his heart. I think that has to be taken with a grain of salt for sure. So I'm
well, he was never a lodge officer. There's no record of that. And the
Correct.
Grand Lodge here in Oklahoma keeps track from the annual returns from the lodges as to who the
Yep.
office.
Yep.
So, as Bob Davis likes to say, there are men who live the craft, and
Yep.
there are men who just say they're Masons.
Correct. 100%. After reading the book, what was your emotional response to the book? Being of American Indian descent, what did you? I mean, you grew up with this. What did you think?
It was a little bit overwhelming because I didn't expect it. Like I said, I was aware of the deaths. I was aware that people were killed for their headright money, but it never really sunk in because, like I showed you, these are families that I grew up with and that I knew personally. I've been in their homes, and there are a whole lot of other families that I know these people, people that I wouldn't say that they're friends, but they're acquaintances. We certainly nod at one another in passing, and I would see them at powwows, and I used to go regularly to the Osage religious ceremonial dances in June that they would have, and we'd see those people there, and we would eat at the feasts, and so it's like they're acquaintances, and this made the experience real. We've actually got families that are being terrorized that we know.
Sure.
So that was kind of the main thing. Now the lawyer in me kicks in, and it's like, well, they certainly didn't talk about the big picture, and they certainly didn't solve all the crimes. But then I guess that was also the Osage's complaint. We're looking at possibly 200 murders, and only 24 got looked at by the FBI. And the actual convictions, there's a conviction for Anna Brown, there's a conviction for Henry Roan, there's a conviction for Bill and Rita Smith. 200 potential murders, 3 convictions.
Well, thank you for your insight. I appreciate it. It was a great presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, the movie may wake a few people up as to those murders. Just like there was a graphic novel comic book back in the 80s called The Watchmen, and there's a reference in that particular graphic novel to the Tulsa event that you referred to earlier, with the Black Wall Street massacre. Growing up, yeah, I'm not a privileged white guy, but I grew up, I'm a white guy. I can't change that. I don't ever remember hearing about that. And I first caught whiff of it in a comic book. And then they did a TV series based on that graphic novel and the movie that the graphic novel influenced. And it was much more prevalent in the HBO series. But, so more people probably know about it now because of what, popular media has referenced it. So maybe this film will get a few more people to investigate it. Who knows? But going back to the Masonic reference in the trailer, I know there's at least one clip in the trailer that shows somebody standing in a Masonic lodge because it has the black and white tessellated floor. And I don't know if you mentioned it, I stepped away for a minute, but I think when you and Bob and I talked, you mentioned about the film company putting in a great deal of money into renovating that lodge and then taking it away. Could you talk about that a little bit? I think the brothers might find that interesting or disgusting, depending on.
Well, we're dealing with small town Oklahoma, and we're dealing with Masons. And in this part of the country, your word is your word. And especially if you shake hands. And so they had agreements with these people from Hollywood about what all would and wouldn't be done and what would be left, what would be improved. And of course, they didn't get it in writing. I mean, it's just not how people do business routinely here. Now, all you worldly New Yorkers are thinking, oh my God, how stupid. Why don't you have a contract? Why don't you have it in writing? Well, in the country, we don't need to do that. And if these Hollywood people were local tradesmen and they went back on their word and the rest of the local community heard about it, well, the rest of the local community would stop doing business with them. And of course, I'm sure that the Masons and their families are just appalled at these Hollywood people, but the Hollywood people are way back in California and they could care less what happens in little tiny Fairfax, Oklahoma. So that's kind of the problem. They, of course, we're expecting to have the air conditioning system fixed. I don't know if you could see in the picture of the building where we had those ducts, there were some broken exterior windows, did not get fixed. They took out the window unit that was in the wall in the lodge room in the southeast corner because that wasn't period, of course, but they didn't patch up the hole. They just stuck it back up there and not very well. They used the dining room of the lodge hall, which at one time back in the 1920s, that was the place for the community to go dance. They ripped up the carpet and they didn't replace it and they didn't refinish the hardwood floor. So the Masons are not happy about that, but that's just life. And all I can say is, well, when you're dealing with white people, you got to get it in writing. Or Peter, whatever he is.
He's part of the Hollywood scene, man.
That's true. That's true. He's more famous than anybody else I know.
That's right.
So does anybody else have any questions for Mark? No questions. I know it's 3.5 hours. Anybody planning on going out to see the film this weekend? And Cliff is going to actually, Cliff, I'm going to be in New York on Saturday. We're visiting my son, so I don't know if we're going to get to see the movie or not. But
well, you really have to plan for it with 3.5 hours.
Yeah, I think this is a film actually because of the length will eventually do much better streaming than it may at the box office.
It may, but what I've seen so far, the cinematography is so vast. I think that you're going to miss so much of this if you look at it on your computer screen. Because if I'm going to stream from Apple, I don't put that on the TV. It's on my iPad. And, this is not the size to capture the grandeur and the scope of the landscapes and seeing the prairie with the sunsets and all of those oil wells everywhere. You just miss out so much of that. And then some of the scenes where they're in Osage ceremonial dancers and you're surrounded by all these men and women in their traditional dance regalia. And that's just a whirlwind. And you're not going to get that on a little screen.
That's true.
Well,
For those who want to stream it, it's going to be on Apple.
Yeah. His last film, The Irishman, remember that went to streaming first, I believe.
Netflix, I think.
Yeah, Netflix, and then it was at a very limited release.
Right.
And it was free to watch, which I was surprised too. So Netflix must have paid him a ton of money. But be that what it may.
Well, that's how it kind of works out, but it's an interesting thing. I probably should have gone ahead and been in it. Since I'm living here in Oklahoma, taking care of my mother, if I'm away for a while, I have to hire ladies to come stay with her. And if you go out to be an extra in some of these movies and TV shows, they don't pay well. And the problem is, I would spend more money on the home health aides than I'm making on my salary. So I worked out this plan where I would apply for things where both my mother and I could be in the cast, and we'd be on cast on the same day. And we were cast for this movie. But when they actually got around to filming, because it was delayed a year because of COVID, The time they were filming all of the Osage Indian elder women was during a 2-week stretch of 100-degree plus temperatures. And the traditional dress that the Osage women wear is made out of wool broadcloth. So try to think about your clothing being made out of a heavy wool blanket. And then on top of that, you take your Indian blanket and you put it on top of that. And it's 100 degrees out. And for those of you who've ever been in a movie or a TV show, you know how you sit around forever and wait. And that just wasn't something that I could take her to do. So we had to cancel. And then she was mad at me. So then I got her in Reservation Dogs. So if you all have Hulu, go look for us in Reservation Dogs. She's in the second episode of the first season, and she got more screen time than I did.
Very good. I see Cliff posted. And Cliff, if you want to unmute and say anything, but Cliff said he's almost done reading the book. He's got tickets for Friday's screening in New York, and theater screening only for him. He says, "Go big or go home."
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hey, Rick, I think there might be some folks who want to say something, but they're muted and they can't unmute. So
Well, I thought I clicked off. Oh wait, maybe I unclicked it. Sorry, I apologize.
Yeah, the boss is telling
you should be able to unmute yourself now. Sorry, I think I had it so that you could unmute yourself before, but I flipped it around.
Yeah, you did. Hey, Rick and Mark, thank you very much for that's a great presentation. I did read the book, and to see some of the pictures and things to go along with that, it really brought it to life. So I appreciate that. But why do you think the producers here focused? I mean, like you said, there was only 2 mentions of Masonry in the entire book, just talking about the pin that Bill Hale wore. Why do you think the focus was turned on Freemasonry? Do you think it's because of the notion of the secret society will play with the audiences, and knowing that it's a veil of secrecy that enabled all this to happen? Is that the point they're trying to make, you think?
I think that that's a possibility, because the real question in investigating these potential 200 murders is not who did it, but who wasn't involved. A lot of the merchants, a lot of the doctors, a lot of the lawyers, a lot of the judges are complicit in these crimes. A lot of people took bribes. A lot of people were essentially involved.
The whole Guardian network was a big suspect as well, right?
So it is. And the whole idea of the competency.
Yeah.
You know, I look at my great-grandfather, who was chief of the Wyandotte tribe. He was a Mason, he was a Knight Templar, he was a Shriner. And in order for him to buy and sell property around his allotment, he had to get a certificate of competency. And you can read this document, and the questions and the answers from people that are interviewed are really pretty insulting, because my great-grandfather was only 1/8 Indian. But they had to talk about him like he was just some idiot child and explain how he could act just like a white man. Well, you know, he's 7/8 white. So, you know, why is that? But it was just part of the system. And the thing that always dismays me the most about how the Oklahoma Indians are treated is a lot of this was designed by Charles Curtis. And you probably don't know that name, but he was vice president for Herbert Hoover. Before that, he was a senator from Kansas for many years, and at one time Senate Majority Leader. So he was a very powerful senator. But he was 3/8 Indian. He was part Kaw or Kansa, depends on which era and what the tribe calls themselves. We call them Kaw today. And the other part was he was descended from Chief Pahuska, so he was part Osage. But he's the one who pushed the idea of applying the Curtis Act of all of this allotment to the Oklahoma Indians, to the 5 civilized tribes, and to the Osages. So a lot of the treatment of Indians in Indian country were at his recommendation. And so what are these congressmen going to think? Here's a real Indian, 3/8, he's going to speak for the whole culture. Here's a real Indian saying, oh, this is what we should do. So, that's just how the history is. But you can look at all of this, and it's repeated from tribe to tribe all over the country.
Well, but in terms of the screenplay, I think that the focus on the Masonry and the sort of the obsession, if you will, with conspiracy theories, it kind of I think that's their play to the public, I think, and we should be concerned about it. There could be some backlash from it, frankly.
Maybe they probably should have focused more on the KKK though, because it's now widely believed that when you're looking at the whole bank of 200 potential murders, that these KKK people who were involved in the Tulsa race massacre were also involved in what was happening on the Osage. Because if you look at the city of Tulsa, Tulsa straddles 3 Indian reservations. Part of it is in Osage County. Part of it's Cherokee Reservation. Part of it's Creek Muskogee Reservation. So they were there. Now, why didn't we focus on that? I didn't really see that mentioned in the book. I really don't think it's going to be mentioned in the movie. So who knows what they did? But as I said, this is historical fiction. They went from being a crime drama to being a wide scope Western. And they created this love story that there really is no basis for. Because there's a lot of reports where you have either a man or a woman that's Osage has somehow ended up married to a white, and they've been suspecting that the white's trying to kill them. And in many cases, they did. So I don't know what kind of love existed between Ernest Burkhart and Molly Kyle. It was certainly her second marriage, and they did have children. They lost one, but they had 2 that survived into adulthood. So how much of this is true? How much of it is just for the sake of the movies and Leo's Oscar? I really don't know.
Yep. I think Cliff has been trying to say something. Go ahead, Cliff.
Just a quick question. The fact that a number of the characters in this story were Freemasons and J. Edgar Hoover was a Freemason, do you think he might have downplayed their membership? Is there any connection, perhaps?
I don't know that he would have cared back in Washington, because it's a very different environment. In Washington, everybody was a Mason in the 1920s and the 1930s, if you were anybody at all. Lots of our DC Masons get exported around. I go to the New York Grand Lodge building and I say, oh, there's a DC Mason. You all are claiming them. But you go to Oklahoma, and I haven't been able to get a full list of the cast to run through different Grand Lodges. It's kind of like, I showed you the commandery sword for H.V. Foster. Well, he's not in the Grand Lodge of Oklahoma Records, but yet we do have documentation that he was in Scottish Rite, and that we have documentation that he was in chapter, and then we've got his sword. But I have yet to find documentation that he was actually in commandery. Of course, why else would he have the sword? But unfortunately, the Grand York Rite records from 100 years ago in Oklahoma have not been well cared for and preserved, and it's just not something that we can research. So I've been looking. I did find 100-year-old grotto records for Bartlesville, which kind of surprised me, but I have not been able to find those early records, because in Bartlesville, the lodge, the chapter, and the commandery were all chartered during the Indian Territory days. So you've got a whole different system. So we shall see. I'm just anxious to go to the theater tomorrow and see what we shall see, and we'll know a lot more then. Anything I can say about what Scorsese and his script writers had in mind with the Masons at this point is purely speculative. But I can tell you that it's not in the book. So this is Hollywood being Hollywood. I don't think this is something where they're going to really try to tear down Masonry, but certainly there are going to be other Masons in Gray Horse Lodge, probably Masons in Pawhuska Washashi Lodge that were somehow involved. Now, they're not going to be the plotters, they're not going to be the trigger men, but they're aiding and abetting. So that's just how it was. But 100 years ago, it's just an Indian. What can I say?
Right. Does anybody else have any questions for Mark?
Yeah, Rusty Henson said, Mark, he said, hello, Mark. Thanks for allowing me to watch this. Hope to watch the rest later. I have read the book 3 times. I used to live in Bowring near the Crossbell Ranch. Sorry, I was tired. He got tied up at Grand Lodge. So he's on.
Some of you may have met Rusty. He was in New York this past weekend with the Masonic degree team.
Ah,
Cool.
looks like Peter Flea has a question.
Thanks for coming, Rusty.
Thanks. Yeah, Mark, you speak about, the initial formation of the Grand Lodge being the unity of those 2 Grand Lodges. To what tradition does the current Grand Lodge of Oklahoma still hold? Do they keep any of the original traditions of the Indian Grand Lodge?
Well, what is the Indian Territory Grand Lodge? They were the original Masonic body in anything that was part of Oklahoma. The first Masonic lodge in what's now Oklahoma was chartered in 1848 in Tahlequah, which is the capital of the Cherokee Nation. And I always found that interesting because one of our federal lodge guys, a young man by the name of William Potter Ross, was initiated, passed, and raised, and also took his chapter degrees in Oklahoma, or excuse me, in DC, and was part of Federal Number 1, and then went back to Tahlequah, where his uncle was the principal chief, and he was the charter secretary of Cherokee Lodge, and then became their 3rd master. So we've always been aware of that. But then the Civil War came, and all of the lodges fell apart, and the records fell apart, and the charters got lost, and all of that. So when we started redoing what became the Grand Lodge of Indian Territory, it was no longer majority Indian. Cherokee Lodge was Cherokee. They had a Creek Lodge. They had a Choctaw Lodge, but no more. So when they put this together, it's kind of like you look at the list of the early members of my Oklahoma Lodge, and it's a lot of oilmen and some of the locals, not so many Indians. That's why I was particularly wanting to look at Gray Horse and Pawhuska and their early membership to see how many Osages were Masons. And in terms of high percentage blood quantum Masons, I don't know any Osages. Now, the current principal chief of the Osages, I understand, I'm not sure if he's petitioned or been elected or what, with the lodge in Pawhuska, but he has not received any degrees. So, I don't know. And then there are some other members of the lodge that are a tiny amount Indian, sometimes Osage, sometimes something else. It's one of the weird things about Oklahoma. It's so intermarried. But a lot of that was, federal policy. My grandparents, for example, met at Chilocco Indian School. So that's how you get a Kickapoo married to a Seminole Wyandotte. And it starts to dilute the bloodlines. As a matter of fact, when we try to figure out who is an Indian and who isn't, legally, I don't know, you all know this, but anybody can claim to be a Native American because that doesn't mean anything. But to be an American Indian, by federal law, you have to be a member of or eligible for membership in a federally recognized Indian tribe. Now, most of the tribes set their own rules. 5 civilized tribes in the Osages, Congress set the rules. So this is why we get into this discussion about Elizabeth Warren. You all have heard of her, senator from back east where y'all are. Well, she grew up in Oklahoma, and her family sort of lived an Indian lifestyle and participated in tribal cultural events and believed that they are Cherokee. But Congress set this rule that said a Cherokee is someone who is on the Dawes Commission rolls that the government took roughly around 1906, 1904 to 1914, somewhere. Cherokees were roughly around 1906. And in order to be an Indian, if you're going to be Cherokee, you have to be on that roll or descended from someone on the roll. Now, the problem is we had a lot of Cherokees who lived in Arkansas and lived in Missouri, where the law was that an Indian could not own real estate. So if you had real estate and it was discovered that you were Indian, you would forfeit your property. So they hid out. They didn't get on the rolls. Elizabeth Warren's family is not on the Dawes Commission rolls. She did the DNA test. And she is, I can't remember the statistics, she's roughly a 164th Indian of some kind. But she can't be on the Cherokee rolls because their ancestors aren't. And the Cherokees have got people that are 0.097% Indian who are legally Indian because their ancestors are on the rolls. And we also have some people that aren't Indian at all, like the governor of Oklahoma right now, whose family fraudulently got on the Cherokee rolls. They're not Indian at all, but legally they're Indians. So, this is just part of our problems and our issues in dealing with all of this around here. But, say hello to Elizabeth. She's Native American, we can say that much, but she's not Indian.
Semantic. All right. Well, listen, Mark, thank you very, very much. You were a fabulous speaker. You really had great knowledge of this entire story. I think you probably sold a few movie tickets tonight. Whether that's a good thing or not, we'll wait and see. Certainly, you probably got some folks interested enough maybe to go out and read the book. So that's great. So thank you very, very much.
My brothers, thank you for spending time with Excelsior 32, the online news source for the Excelsior Project from the New York Council of Deliberation, Ancient Accepted Scottish Rite, Northern Masonic Jurisdiction. Please remember that the experiences, comments, opinions, and views shared on this program have been those of the individual Freemasons and do not reflect the official position of any Grand Lodge, concordant, or appendant body. And until we meet again, travel safe and keep on reaching higher. Good night.
Thanks for spending time with Excelsior 32. The experiences, comments, opinions, and views shared on this program are those of individual Freemasons and do not reflect the official position of any Grand Lodge, concordant, or appendant body. Until we meet again, keep on reaching higher.